let me ask you about parting of the Red Sea, when Moses parted the Red Sea.
Oh, I know that. Well, I don't know what parting means.
Like he separated the sea.
Oh, I totally know that one. I watched a movie about that one. So, the prince of Egypt was not letting his people go, but then Moses said, got little things called plagues. So the Israelites were running away from the people who don't believe in God. And then they got stuck at the Red Sea. The Egyptians were they're chasing him, and then they got blocked off to the Red Sea. And they don't think that they're telling what to do. Panic. We're going to die. And God will make a way. So, he split the sea. Then Moses raised his staff, and then it spread it apart the sea. The Red Sea parted, and then they walked through. But when the Egyptians came through, the sea and closed in again. It splashed down on the Pharaoh's people, and then it washed away all the bad guys.
Like if you saw the sea split apart, what would you do?
I'd walk across, and I'd be so confused because they stood it on us, but not them, and I'd be mad. Probably I would do like this.
Well, good morning, friends. How many of you guessed it right? Number 3 in our countdown of the top 10 Bible stories for life of faith, Moses and the parting of the Red Sea. I'm excited to dive into this. Good morning, friends. So good to be here with you. If you're a new friend, welcome. So glad you're here. This is a great time to connect and to jump into everything that's happening here at Lake Norman Baptist. I hope you'll join us for that First Steps lunch and join the 70 or so people over the last few months who've found their people and found their place. It's a great time to jump in and a great series to be a part of together. We've been having a lot of fun with this. Also, I just want to say a quick word to those of you who consider this your church home. You're a part of the Lake Norman Baptist family. This is also a really important month that we're coming into. We're now in August, unbelievably. Feels like October out there right now, so we'll take that. But this is a super important month for us in the mission and vision that God has called us to. So if you've been around for 10 minutes, you know that our mission is to bring healing, connection, and purpose to people all around Lake Norman through the love of Jesus. And this is a critical month for us in the mission God has called us to. It's the last month of our fiscal year. And in our fiscal year, we lean really hard on 2 months in particular, December and August, to fund all of the work that God has called us to. Both of those months, we need about twice what comes in on an ordinary month. So if this is your church family, I just want to encourage you, if you have the margin, if you have the capacity to make a special gift this month to support the work that God has called us to do, let me encourage you to do that. You can do it in person. You can do it online through our website. You can be a part of all that God is doing and seeing this happen continually into the new ministry year that we're launching in September. Along with that, I want to say to many of you who faithfully give month after month, you've made a commitment to give and you're giving. Thank you for that. We're not asking anything more of you. Please just continue to give in the way that God has called you. But especially if you're new or if you're not in a regular habit of giving, this is a great way to jump in and be a part of all that God is doing. It meets a critical need for us in our annual rhythm of serving the cause that God has called us to. Speaking of the cause that God has called us to, it's so helpful, isn't it, when we have a window into what God is doing. And that's really what we have in this story today. If you were with us last week and we saw the story of Esther, we saw a story that highlighted a lot of stuff that happened in these people's lives. God brought opportunities their way, and it invited us to consider how God might be at work behind the scenes in the ordinary opportunities of life. Well, this week is exactly the opposite. This week gives us a unique window into God and how he works. He explains some things to us about how he works in salvation, and we're invited to consider how God might be doing some of these things in the opportunities and the circumstances of our lives. So we're going to see how God works, and we're going to consider how that might trickle down into our experiences that we live day in and day out. And this is super important, isn't it? Because sometimes we don't understand what's going on. We might be confused about what God is doing in our lives. We might wonder, like, what's God up to? Like, why is he bringing this? Or is God even doing anything in my life? Should I even believe in this God? Because I'm really confused about what I'm seeing happen. Sometimes that's our reality and we get stuck there. Sometimes we get fearful. Things happen and they just make us afraid. Other times we get trapped. We feel stuck. We're not sure what to do next. This is just a reality for us. And this story is so helpful because it's going to show us how this same thing happened in the lives of the Israelites way back in the Old Testament, and how they were able to overcome that confusion, that fear, that sense of being trapped because of the way that God worked for their salvation. And the good news for us is that God still works today. This story, maybe more than any other biblical story, is connected to everything that we see in the Bible. There are connections from creation all the way through to Revelation, to the experience of Adam and Eve in the garden, all the way to what Jesus has done for us and what he will do when he comes again. And we're going to see those connections as this story unfolds. But to get us to the opening scene of this story, I just want to lay a little bit of a foundation for what was happening in the lives of the Israelites that led to this miraculous parting of the Red Sea that we see in the Old Testament book of Exodus. So, a few chapters before, in the middle of Genesis, God had given Abraham this promise that he was going to deliver Abraham's descendants into the promised land. This was his great promise to Abraham. But of course, there was this period of time before the promised land, they were going to be enslaved in Egypt. So for 430 years, the Israelites were in slavery in Egypt, but according to God's promise, he was going to deliver them and bring them out. And that's what we're going to read about today, is how God brought them out of that long season of slavery, 400 plus years in slavery in Egypt, and how he would bring them on a journey to his promised land and fulfill his promise. And in order to do that, we get introduced at the beginning of the book of Exodus to a man named Moses. Now, his entry into the world is special. I mean, really special. And it came at a really difficult time. So he was born about 350 years into this period of slavery, where the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. And when he was born, it was at a particularly difficult time because the Pharaoh was very fearful, very afraid of the Israelites multiplying and becoming so powerful that they could overtake Egypt. And this gripped the Pharaoh with so much fear that he was oppressing the Israelites as slaves, and even got to the point at the end of Exodus chapter 1 where he declared that every Hebrew boy who was born was to be executed by throwing them into the Nile River. And that was the context into which Moses was born. Moses was born under this edict that he should have been thrown into the Nile River and executed. But in Exodus 2, we read this wonderful story about how Moses was protected, and they put him in a little basket, which, interestingly, those who study the ancient Hebrew language, the same language is spoken of that basket as was spoken of Noah's ark. So a little mini ark was created to deliver Moses from execution by being thrown into the Nile River. And that deliverance landed him in Pharaoh's household. It said Pharaoh's daughter found him in that little basket, took him home, raised him as her son, so he became Pharaoh's grandson, and spent the next 40 years of his life, from birth to age 40, growing up in Pharaoh's palace. Then there was this unfortunate incident where Moses saw an Egyptian oppressing an Israelite. He stepped in, and he actually murdered this Egyptian who was beating this Israelite, and as a result, he was cast out. And he spent the next 40 years of his life, from 40 to 80, out in the wilderness of Midian. And then the Lord found Moses out there in the wilderness. He came to him in a burning bush, and he said, "Moses, it's time. I've heard the cry of my people after 430 years of slavery, and I want you to go to Pharaoh and tell them, your God says, let my people go." And so that's what we see in Exodus 10 through 12 is these plagues. And I love what the little girl said. What are they? Plugs? No, plagues. So we see the story of the plagues, and it's this battle between God and Pharaoh. It's God demonstrating his power over Pharaoh. And of course, if you know the story, we're back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And in the end, Pharaoh said, go. And that's what we see in Exodus chapter 12. Pharaoh said, all right, go, Moses. Your God wins. Take your people and go. And that leads us to the opening scene of what we're going to read about today in the end of Exodus 13 into Exodus 14. And we're seeing how God is going to work for the salvation of his people. This is how God works. And this wasn't just for these people at this time. Throughout the Bible, this is seen as the great model of how God saves. So if you have experienced salvation, if you have put your faith and trust in Jesus, if your sins have been forgiven, then you have experienced spiritually what we're going to read about historically. If you're new to Christianity and you're just hearing all of these things and maybe trying to process them and ask questions about what does this mean? Is there really a God? Does he really care for me? The invitation for you, the opportunity for you is to experience the kind of salvation that we're going to read about in this story. And so there's something here for all of us. We see how God works and how we can respond to him. And so the first thing in this story that we're going to see together is how God moves people to a place of salvation. If you are a Christian, if you're a follower of Jesus, a child of God, then God has at some point in your life moved you to a place of salvation. If you've not taken that step yet, God might be at work right now moving you to a place of salvation, because this is what God does. And we're going to see it in vivid detail in the opening of this story. So we're going to go to the end of Exodus 13, beginning in verse 17. It says, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said, if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people on the desert road toward the Red Sea. The Israelites went up out of Egypt, ready for battle. Moses took the bones of Joseph with him, because Joseph had made the Israelites swear an oath. He had said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up with you from this place. After leaving Succoth, they camped at Etham on the edge of the desert. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. Neither the pillar of cloud by day nor the pillar of fire by night left its place in front of the people. So God moves his people to a place of salvation, and we see here some ways that he does it. So the first detail that emerges is God didn't take them on the short route out of Egypt toward the promised land. God actually took them on a longer route. So we're going to throw a map up here just to sort of briefly orient ourselves to this. And I know it's small, but you don't need to see all the detail. The idea is the Red Sea there in the bottom left corner stretches up toward the Mediterranean Sea. And there's a connection there through some of those smaller rivers and lakes that attach that are part of the Red Sea system connect up to the Mediterranean Sea. That shorter route that's mentioned would follow the border of the Mediterranean Sea from Egypt up to the far right corner in Canaan. But the text tells us specifically God didn't take them on the short route. God took them along a longer route down toward the desert, away from the Mediterranean Sea. And he did this for a purpose. He did this so that the people wouldn't turn around and go back if they ran into the Philistines and they faced war. God knew the temptation of the human heart was to turn around and go right back. So he led them in a path that would help them continue their way toward his salvation. And that's one of the details that we see. Second really interesting detail is a connection to the story of Joseph. If you missed it, in case you missed it, a few weeks ago, number 9 on our countdown was the story of Joseph. And Joseph was commended for his faith because he was the one who got the people from Canaan into Egypt at that time to save their lives from the famine. But Joseph believed the promise that God had given his great-grandfather Abraham. And he said, in 400 some odd years, God's going to keep his promise and he's going to bring you out. And when he does, take my bones with you, because I don't want to be buried in Egypt. I want to be buried in God's promised land. And that's a pretty cool detail, isn't it? They remembered over 400 years later, generations later, and they took Joseph's bones with them. And then we're told how God led them. With this pillar of cloud out in front at day, this pillar of fire at night, like a good shepherd, he's out in front of his people, leading them along the way of salvation. This is God moving his people to a place of salvation. And throughout the Bible, this is seen as a model, as a paradigm of how God works in this process of salvation. And so what happens when God leads people to a place of salvation, we learn the next truth about God's plan, and that is this: God has a plan for saving his people. And that's important for us to know as well. We're going to see very clearly in this story that when God moved his people to the place of salvation, he didn't stop and wonder what to do next. They did, like we do. But God has a plan for saving his people, and we're going to see that plan unfold in the first 4 verses of Exodus 14. It says this: Then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea, directly opposite Baal-zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion and hemmed in by the desert. And I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord." So the Israelites did this. So if we throw that map back up one more time, if you Google map of the Exodus, you'll get all kinds of different maps, and they'll all have different places for all of these locations that we just read in this story. However you say it, Pi-hahiroth and the others, they're mapped in all sorts of different places. And what's important about that is historians, scholars are trying to sort of piece all this history back together. There's no way to really pinpoint where these towns were at that time, because over time they moved and relocated. And that's okay. Like, we don't have to know today exactly where all those were, but we can know because they were listed in the text. One of the reasons that they're listed in such detail in the text is that these were historical places that God brought his people at this point in history. And we don't have to know exactly where they were on a map. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing is God had a plan, and he took them on it. And that's what we see. We see this historical detail showing us that God knew exactly what he was doing, and this plan is revealed in the story. So for those of you note takers, I've just given you 2 points about how God works. He moves people to a place of salvation, and then we see that he has a plan of salvation. Now I want you to put a placeholder. You could write a number 3, but we're not going to go there yet, because in the story, we go from God explaining what he's doing to actually fulfilling those plans. And he takes us into this 3-part plan of what it looked like when God fulfilled his saving plan. And that's what we see outlined in this passage we just read. He said 3 things are going to happen. God's going to outsmart Pharaoh, God's going to harden Pharaoh's heart, and then God is going to deliver his people and gain glory for himself. And so, with the backdrop of God's saving actions, we're going to zoom in and see how this 3-part plan actually took place in delivering the Israelites at this place and time. This is a battle between God and his enemy, Pharaoh. And it's one of the many battles that began between God and his enemies all the way back in creation. And we're going to see how God gains glory. So the first part of the plan is this: God outsmarts his enemies. Remember, we just read, Pharaoh's going to think something, but that's going to set up God's victory. We see it in verses 5 through 7. It says, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with the officers over all of them. So the king is getting messages from his scouts that are watching what the people of Israel are doing. And by the way, the people of Israel were massive. We're told that it was 600,000 men that God freed from Egypt, plus their wives, plus the women, plus the children, plus a bunch of livestock, flocks and herds, plus a lot of other people that just joined along with them. Historians estimate that it was between 2 and 3 million people that were on this journey on foot in the Exodus. That's hard for us to wrap our minds around, but do you know the current population of the greater Charlotte area? 2.8 million people. So this is like everybody, all of us in Lake Norman, down to like Rock Hill, from Gastonia to Concord, and everybody in the middle with all of our pets and everybody else, journeying out of Charlotte on our way to the promised land. For many of us, Charlotte is the promised land, but the analogy sort of breaks down at some point. But just to wrap our minds around the massive nature of this, these are the people that God had freed. And so when Pharaoh's getting these messages, he says, oh my goodness, we messed up, and look, they're wandering around in the desert, just like God said. Pharaoh thinks there's an opportunity to get them back, and so he mobilizes his best and brightest, his 600 best chariots, along with all the rest of the chariots. And what we see in that is Pharaoh saw an opportunity. God outsmarted Pharaoh in an opportunity to draw him out to do something that would bring salvation for his people. Pharaoh saw the opportunity, and he took it. 1,500 years after this, we see another interesting story where the enemies of God's Son, the Messiah, saw an opportunity to take him out, and they took it. But it was in service of God's greater plan. God is at work outsmarting his enemies as he moves his people to a place of salvation and works out his plan. And so that's what happened. The first part of God's plan worked. Pharaoh thought he had an opportunity, and he went for it, which leads to part 2 of God's plan. God told Moses, he said, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. So part 2 is that God hardens his enemies. Not only is he outsmarting his enemies, but he's hardening his enemies. And this is where it's going to get real. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites and overtook them as they encamped by the sea near Pi-hahiroth, opposite Baal-Zephon. And so, saw the opportunity, hardened his heart, went after the Israelites. And so this led to a chain reaction of the people. First, we're going to see how the Israelites react when they see Pharaoh and his army coming. Then we're going to see Moses react to them, and then finally God react to Moses. So here's the Israelites' reaction when Pharaoh and his armies were approaching. It said, as Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified, understandably, and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. So this sounds more spiritual actually in the text than it really was. Historians say, this crying out to God for help was more of a panic attack than it was a prayer for help. They freaked out when they saw Pharaoh and his people coming, to the point that they forgot that God had just delivered them 3 days ago by the firstborn being saved, and they were allowed to come out through the great Passover event. They had forgotten that for generations they had cried out to God in Egypt, deliver us, deliver us, deliver us. They forgot all that and said, actually, come to think of it, it was better in Egypt. So they're crying out to God. They had a panic attack. They were afraid, and they freaked out. And lest we get too judgy, kind of happens to us too, doesn't it? Sometimes things come our way, and our first instinct, just like one of the kids said, we do the only thing we know to do, panic. And so that's what the Israelites did. And then you hear Moses reacting to them, and this was Moses' reaction to the Israelites. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. He said, be still and watch what God's going to do. Moses didn't quite know what God was going to do yet, But he knew he was going to bring deliverance and gain glory for himself. And he says, all you got to do is be still. And then we have God's reaction to Moses and the Israelites' reaction. In chapter 14, verse 15, we see this. Then the Lord said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Now, if you're paying attention to the detail, that might be a little bit surprising. First of all, Moses wasn't the one crying out to God in that freak out moment. He wasn't the one having the panic attack, and yet God speaks to him as if he was. Interesting connection in this text, and we're going to see it more explicitly in just a few minutes. Moses was the representative of the people. God had given Moses the plan. Moses was the servant through whom God would deliver all of his people. Moses was the mediator between God and his people. And so the sins of the people were on Moses. Does that sound familiar? As Moses stood in the place of his people, he was a Christ figure that God was using for the deliverance of his people. What's also interesting is Moses had just told the people, be still. But God said, actually, move on. It's time to move forward as I bring my deliverance. So the Israelites were threatened. They were fearful. They panicked. But if they were going to serve God as a new people being delivered out of slavery in Egypt to become a nation of their own, then they were going to have to learn to trust God. And this is part of the lesson that God would teach them. So now's the time I'm going to give you the third point about God's salvation. God moves his people to a place of salvation. God has a plan for saving his people. And then in real time, at the right time, God reveals his plan. God reveals his plan when the time is right. And this is what we see unfold in the next few verses. God said, Moses, raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through on the sea on dry ground. I will harden the hearts of the Egyptians so that they will go in after them, and I will gain glory through Pharaoh and all his army, through his chariots and his horsemen. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. So here's God revealing more detail about his plan. How am I going to deliver the people? Moses, I'm going to deliver them right through the Red Sea. It's going to be a miraculous party. They're not trapped up against these waters like Pharaoh thinks they are. But you're going to stretch out your hand, and I'm going to lead the people through. And then he reminded them, I'm going to still harden the Egyptians' hearts, but I'm going to gain glory through them. And this is God establishing himself as the ruler, as the sovereign ruler, instead of Pharaoh. Remember, these Israelites, all they'd ever known was Pharaoh as king. All of them were born in Egypt. The generations that preceded them were born in Egypt. And so they're getting to know this God of their ancestors, Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. And God is going to gain glory by establishing himself as their king, not Pharaoh. And when he says, I will gain glory, that's not some sort of a pompous, self-aggrandizing glory. That's the way Pharaoh gained glory. God would gain the glory of a saving king. And that's an important name for God, the saving king, the God who loves his people and acts on their behalf out of love to save them. He's not like Pharaoh. He's not like the kings of the world. He's not like his great enemy. He's going to gain the glory of a saving king. And for those who see that glory, they receive his love. This is the glory that God is going to gain. And he's going to gain that glory among the Egyptians. The Egyptians are going to see, oh, the Israelite God, he is the true God. And then the Israelites themselves will see his glory and turn and follow, learn to fear him, learn to trust him, learn to follow after him. And so now we see the third part of God's plan unfold. Now that we've seen the three ways that God works, the final part of his plan emerges. Part 3, God frees his people from his enemies. So far, he has outsmarted his enemy, Pharaoh. He has hardened Pharaoh's heart to continue pursuing his people, even though it frightened them. God was at work in that. And now we see that when the time is right, God reveals his plan and he frees his people from their enemies. And we see it beginning in verse 19. Then the angel of God, who had been traveling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night, the cloud brought darkness to the one side and light to the other, so neither went near the other all night long. So the angel of the Lord, his presence is there in that cloud, in that fire, and we're told that it moved from out in front of the Israelites, leading them, to around behind them, protecting them. And it did so all through the night. Now, in case you missed it, like I did, this whole deliverance story of the parting of the Red Sea happened through the night. And isn't that when our confusion is the greatest? Isn't that when our fears are the most paralyzing? Isn't that when we wonder the most whether God really is there? Through the night, God acted to deliver his people. He protected them from the Egyptians while he saved his people and came through in his plan of salvation. And so it continues. As God is protecting them, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left. Here's another detail you might have missed. For hours the wind blew. It wasn't like an immediate instant, going from the sea looking like this to looking like this. No, the people had time to feel the wind, to see something happening. Can you imagine like the first early moments of that? Like they're seeing the sea lit up by this great fire in the middle of the night, and it's like, wait a second, is the water changing? Like, is it going down and going up on the sides? As they're watching God work, carrying out his plan to deliver them. Which is another connection to the way God works in salvation. It's usually not instantaneous, is it? God works, and we begin to see, and we peer closer, and we try to discern. Yes, actually, in fact, God is working. And through the night, that wind blew and blew and blew, and then the waters, we're told, were standing up like a wall on either side. And then the story continues. The people passed through on dry ground, and then the Egyptians pursued them. And all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen followed them into the sea. During the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army and threw it into confusion. He jammed the walls of their chariots, the wheels of their chariots, so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians said, "Let's get away from the Israelites. The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." So around the time that this massive caravan of the Israelites makes it to the other side, or just about to the other side, God releases that barrier of cloud and fire, and here come the Egyptians running right on into the Red Sea. They think they've got an opportunity. The way is opened. But then, of course, God acts on their behalf to get glory. And he gained glory by supernaturally jamming the wheels of those chariots. Maybe they got stuck in the mud. Maybe it was hard enough to walk on foot, but not to go through these wheels. But maybe it was something more obviously supernatural than that, because the Egyptians gave God glory. They gave him credit. They recognized that these people's God was doing something supernatural against them. And so God gained glory. God gained credit for acting on their behalf. And all this happened during the last watch of the night, which is another significant detail. It would have been about 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So the last dark hours of the night are when all of this happened, when the Israelites pursued, the Egyptians pursued the Israelites into the Red Sea. Do you know what else happened during the last watch of the night? We saw it in number 8 in our countdown of the top 10 Bible stories for a life of faith. Jesus walked on water, we're told, during the last watch of the night, as he came for the salvation of his disciples who were in the storm on the boat. So God is working. He's working to deliver his people and to rescue them from their enemies. The story continues. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians and their chariots and horsemen." Remember, their wheels were jammed. They were stuck trying to get away, but they can't. And then in verse 27, Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak, the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived. One of the kids got it right. God got rid of the bad guys. Not one of them survived. And one of the connections that we see in this is the accountability that God introduced into the world through Noah. After the flood, God dealt with the corruption in the world by holding human beings accountable for the lives of other humans. And you remember when Moses was born, the Pharaoh was taking the lives of every Hebrew boy that was born by throwing them into the Nile so that they would drown. And in an act of accountability, human life for human life, here's God drowning the Egyptian army in the water, following that same sentence that he gave those Hebrew boys some 80 years earlier when Moses was born. Here's God working for the salvation of his people. And just like the flood in Noah's day, it brought destruction for God's enemies and salvation for his people. And so God works, moving his people to a place of salvation, carrying out his plan for saving his people, revealing his plan at just the right time. He's outsmarting his enemies. Sometimes he's hardening the heart of his enemies, but he's delivering his people from his enemies. Which leads us to our response. How do we respond, and what do we learn in this story for how to respond to God's act of salvation on our behalf? What God has done for us in the new Moses, the new leader of God's people, the servant of God given for our salvation, Jesus Christ. So when we experience salvation, we serve a new king. And this is what God's people were learning to do. They were learning to see the God of their ancestors as the true king, not Pharaoh, and they learned how to respond to him. So Exodus 14, this is the conclusion of the chapter. But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. That day the Lord saved Israel from the hands of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians lying dead on the shore. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of God displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, put their trust in him, and in Moses, his servant. They learned to trust God as their king, not the pagan king Pharaoh. One scholar said this marks the end of Israel's servitude to Egypt and the beginning of their servitude to God. And so they would learn how to respond to this saving king who had delivered them. And the first part of that response was they learned to fear God. They learned to fear God, which is another way of saying to give him glory, to give him credit for his work in all of the things that they were seeing. They were now seeing the explanation. Hindsight was 20/20. They discovered what God had been doing all along, and they gave him glory. They learned to fear God. What does the Proverbs say? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. The writer of Ecclesiastes, the final duty of all mankind is to fear the Lord and obey his commands. This is the response of the people toward God. They learned to fear him. Not in a way that they would fear Pharaoh, like a terrified fear of his retribution, but a fear of awe and worship and celebration of what God would do. And then out of that fear, giving glory to God, they learned to trust God. They would learn to trust God. And as these stories are recast and reminders come throughout the Bible, especially in the Psalms, you see many times the psalmist referring to the Exodus story, the parting of the Red Sea, as an invitation for God's people to trust him, to see his grace and mercy, to see his love in this act of saving deliverance. And this is what the people learned to do. They went from panic to trust. Which leads to the third part of the response. They feared God, they put their trust in God, and in Moses, his servant. For you and me, as we consider our response, it's an invitation to follow Jesus. And this is the most practical part of the response, because to put their trust in God and to fear God, what did that actually mean they did? That meant they went where Moses was, and they followed what Moses did. And that's where the salvation was found. They learned to put their trust in Moses, the servant of God. And in the New Testament, we don't have time to read it, but if you want to read 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and Romans chapter 6, we have this connection that all the while, the people, the text says, were baptized into Moses. It's an initiation word of identifying with Moses. They identified with Moses. And as long as they identified with Moses, they experienced God's salvation. And in 1 Corinthians 10, we're told that was actually the Spirit of Christ at work, even through Moses. And then Romans 6 tells us when we are baptized, when we identify with Jesus, that's how we put our trust in God. That's how we live out our fear of God, our reverence for him, acknowledging that he's at work in all things. So fear God, trust God, follow Jesus in the way that these Israelites followed Moses. Which, if you're really looking to put this on the ground, that means be where Jesus is. Go where Jesus goes. Do what Jesus does. And where is Jesus at work in the world today? Right here. In his church, in his people. Churches all around the world. It's the body of Christ. So if you're looking to learn how to follow Jesus, you plug in with Jesus' people. You go where Jesus goes and do what Jesus does. That's why our mission is to bring healing, connection, and purpose to people all around Lake Norman through the love of Jesus, because that's what Jesus does. And so if you want to know how to take a step of following Jesus, you join in and follow him with others who are on this journey. And that's an opportunity for us, no matter which side of the Red Sea you are on. Because one of the clear portraits that we see in this story is how God works in our salvation. Egypt is our slavery to sin. It's that evil that taints everything that we do. That's our Egypt. The Red Sea is the death sentence. We come to the end of ourselves and we can go no further or we will die. But Jesus' death and burial and resurrection for our salvation is the parting of the sea. It's the opening up of the way to experience forgiveness, to experience salvation, to be brought to the promised land, to be with him in heaven forever. And so my question for us today is, which side of the Red Sea are you on? Are you confused, fearful, stuck, wondering where God is and how he is at work in your life and how you can be saved? You can be saved by putting your faith and trust in God, by following Jesus, recognizing that when he gave his life for you, that's what opens the way for you to cross that Red Sea and to be a part of God's people and experience his salvation. And if you're on the other side of the Red Sea, if you have come to the place in your life where you have experienced his salvation, the call for us is to remember. Remember what he's done for you. And that's what we do when we come to communion. We remember Jesus' death and burial and resurrection on our behalf. And so that's what we're going to do today. For those of you who have taken that step of putting your faith and trust in Jesus, if you've crossed that Red Sea and become the people of God, we're going to remember what Jesus has done for us. And if you've not yet taken that step, I want to invite you. You could take today as your opportunity to cry out to God, to give him the glory, to recognize that he is at work for you and your salvation. Place your faith and trust in him and become part of the people of God, experience his salvation. So can I invite our deacons who are present, who are ready to serve our communion elements, to go ahead and come forward. If this is your first time participating in communion here at Lake Norman Baptist, you don't have to be a member or a regular attender. But if you have crossed the Red Sea, you've put your faith in Jesus, we invite you to participate with us, to remember what Jesus has done for you. There are 2 cups that are inside one another. Take them both out of the tray when it comes. The juice is in the top, the bread is below. All the wafers are gluten-free, and we take them together in just a moment when I lead us. And in these moments, I just want to encourage you. Have a conversation with God. Remember how he has worked in your life to bring you to a place of salvation. And if he's bringing you to that place of salvation right now, respond. Fear him. Put your trust in him. Become a follower of Jesus. Let me pray for us as we come to communion. Father God, we thank you for this great story of salvation, of deliverance. And we thank you not only that you did this on behalf of your people in real time and in real space in history, but that it shows us how powerfully you have given your son Jesus to save us from a much deeper slavery, to free us from our sin,